Hello and welcome everyone to the second podcast for day 38, where we're talking about photosynthesis. In this podcast, we're going to talk only about objective 3. As we're talking about objective 3, we're going to focus on the two parts of photosynthesis, the two different reactions of it, and how this generates the products that is necessary for photosynthesis. Let's go ahead and get started then. All right, let's go ahead and get started by talking about the two main stages of photosynthesis. And this is found in chapter 10 on figure 10.6 if you want to refer to it. Before we begin, let's remind ourselves what the reaction of photosynthesis is. 6 carbon dioxides plus light energy plus water are converted into 1 glucose plus 6 oxygen molecules. There was a slight typo on this part of the podcast, and I can't go back and change what I wrote in the marker, but I did place this little box here with the correct 6 oxygen molecules indicated there, just in case you're wondering why it looks different all of a sudden. So the first reaction is the light reaction. And the other reaction is called the Calvin cycle. Sometimes you may find an older book, that might call it the dark reaction or the dark cycle. The only problem with using that term is it implies that it only occurs in the dark, and that's not the case. Both of these reactions occur within the chloroplasts. The light reactions occur within the thylakoid membrane. So I'm going to draw it like this. Whereas this Calvin cycle occurs within the stroma. Let's go and represent this as a cycle, as a kind of a cyclical cycle here. So how do we use these two reactions to complete this equation? Water is fed into the light reaction with our light energy. And this results in the release of oxygen. The Calvin cycle takes CO2, same CO2 here, it's fed into the Calvin cycle and it releases sugar, the glucose molecule. How are these two reactions linked then? We can see how they take these products, these reactants, and generate these products in both cases. But we say they're all part of photosynthesis, so that might imply that these two reactions are linked, and they are. The light reaction generates ATP and NADPH. Both ATP and NADPH are needed to drive the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle then releases ADP and NADP+. And both of these are taken up into the light reactions. It looks like a pretty complicated picture here, but let's go through it again so you can kind of piece all this together. Photosynthesis, 6 CO2, 6 waters gives us glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. Okay, so let's review this. Water enters into the light reaction with light energy. It produces oxygen. In this process, it uses ADP and NADP+. As a byproduct of these reactions, it generates ATP and NADPH. These are then fed into this Calvin cycle. Fed into the top of the Calvin cycle is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is then converted into sugars. It builds up the carbons in its structure, and it releases glucose. In this process, it requires ATP and NADPH, which it gets from the light reaction. Byproducts of the Calvin cycle are ADP and NADP+, which are then fed into the light reaction. So these two reactions are intricately linked because of what they produce as these byproducts. So the light reaction. Let's think about its input its output, and then finally its purpose, because everything needs a purpose. Input is water and light energy. In addition, NADP plus and ADP. And remember, it gets these two components from the Calvin cycle. What is about its output? Well, it produces NADPH and ATP. Both of these go into the Calvin cycle. And then finally, it produces oxygen. And oxygen is going to get fed into respiration. So we want to give it a purpose. The first purpose is that the light reaction drives the Calvin cycle. The second purpose is that it provides oxygen for respiration. This respiration can occur within the plant cells itself, or the oxygen can be released and taken up by a heterotroph. We'll make a similar list when we get to the Calvin cycle, but let's spend a little bit more time talking about the light reaction. So within the light reaction, how, or you might say why, is light energy needed? Well, this light energy, as this light is coming down to the Earth from 90 plus million miles away, it's packaged up into something called a photon. So let's describe what this photon does. Let's draw our chlorophyll molecule, so chlorophyll. It's going to absorb light from this photon. So here comes the light. And what happens is, as that light is absorbed by this pigment chlorophyll, it excites the electrons in it. Until it's, what we would say is it's at its excited state. At this state, this is a pretty important part here, is that it has a great amount of potential energy. And once it gets way up here, just like a rock at the top of a cliff or of a building, when you push it back down, it comes crashing down and generates a tremendous amount of kinetic energy. And it's released as heat and a fluorescent light. This heat is necessary for these reactions. For a review of this, you can look at figure 10.12. So the energy comes into the chloroplast, it excites it, and then the energy is released in the form of heat and light. So your note taking, guys, is follow the energy in the light reaction. So this is the direction. It comes from here into the chlorophyll, and then it's released as heat. That's all we really want from that. Let's erase this, and let's talk more about the Calvin cycle. And just like we did with the light reaction, let's ask, what are the inputs? What are the outputs? And just like the light reactions, this Calvin cycle also has to have a purpose. So the inputs are carbon dioxide. This comes from respiration. When we respire, when the plant respires, we release CO2 as a byproduct. In addition, inputs include ATP and NADPH, and these both come from the light reaction. The outputs are NADP plus and ADP, and these get fed back into the light reaction, and it releases sugar. So what's the purpose of the Calvin cycle? Well, just like the light reactions drove the Calvin cycle drives the light reaction. Its products, its output, NADP plus and ADP, are necessary for the light reactions to proceed. The other is that it produces these sugars which the plant uses. So sugars for the plant or for heterotrophs that eat the plants. So let's draw out the Calvin cycle. It's on figure 1019 if you want to look at it, but we're going to talk about a much simplified version of it. CO2 enters this cycle, and it enters it because there is a CO2 acceptor. So we're going to write CO2 acceptor. It's very important because without this CO2 acceptor, the cycle cannot proceed. As this cycle continues, it goes through several reactions that you don't need to worry about, and it makes glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and we're just going to call it G3P. We call this first part carbon fixation. And on the bottom part of this, there's a stage that we call reduction. You really need to know carbon fixation because we're fixing the carbon up here so it can enter into this cycle so we can generate G3P. And why is it important that we generate G3P? Because G3P can do two things. One thing it can do is make glucose or other organic material. G3P can also stay in this cycle, and this part of the cycle we call it a rather bulky name here, regeneration of that CO2 acceptor. So G3P can do either one of these, and it does both of them. So G3P that is involved in regenerating this CO2 acceptor, don't worry about the name of the acceptor, but let's just write it here as an acceptor. Right here. Now, I forgot to mention, didn't really forget to mention, but wanted to save it till now. This step here, where CO2 is bound to this acceptor, is catalyzed by my favorite enzyme called rubisco. Rubisco is the most abundant enzyme on the entire planet, and it plays this very, very important role in helping bring in this carbon dioxide molecule, this first carbon, so that this cycle can occur to generate large molecules of glucoses or structures containing glucoses and maintain this cycle going forward. So rubisco, most abundant enzyme in the world, and it plays a role in catalyzing this carbon dioxide entering into the cycle by binding to this carbon dioxide acceptor. Okay, that ends this podcast, and it ends day 38 on photosynthesis. If you have any questions, please let us know. See you in class. Bye.